So, form is one of those subjects that composers talk about all the time, but music producers, they talk about it, but not really in the right way, in my opinion. Conversations around form tend to be kind of like genre specific. They tend to revolve around the idea of like verses and choruses or like builds and drops. Or worse yet, they are talked about in the context of breaking out of the loop. This is going to be a video where I'm kind of just yapping. We're not going to be doing anything in the DAW because this is going to cover things that you should be doing before you even open your DAW. Stuff you scribble down on paper or take notes in a document before any actual musical material gets written. So this conversation about like breaking out of the loop leads to something that I call the staircase problem, and it usually goes something like this. You write some sort of chord progression maybe, and you loop that, and then you write a melody, and you loop that, and then you write a bass line, and you loop that, and then you write percussion, and then drums, and all of these elements are stacked on top of each other. So you have this big like vertical stack of musical elements. And then often what people tend to do is distribute those elements that you've stacked vertically horizontally. So it just kind of becomes this thing where you have like your chord progression going for a while, and then you add a melody, and then you add some percussion, and then you add some bass, and then you're just kind of like adding stuff on top of each other. And the reason it's a problem is because it works to a point. You know, that does take this 8-bar loop that you wrote and it makes your track longer. But in my opinion, it often just feels like a bunch of loops. So what's the solution to this? There's a comedian named Matteo Lane, who is a creative person who I really respect and I really admire their approach to the creative process, who was on Mike Birbiglia's podcast. And one of the things he brought up, whenever it comes to starting a new project, writing a joke, writing some music, anything like that, is it's always more productive to start broad and then get more specific. I think the analogy he uses is a sculptor, right? If you have this massive piece of marble, you have to get the general shape of what you want first and then start chiseling in the details.
You have to work general to specific. Yeah. All art is the same. Work general to specific. You can't make a statue by starting with just the eye. Get the general shape down first and slowly work your way in. General to specific.
So the method I'm going to show you as it relates to music production is a method in which we map out 128 bars worth of form before we even write any music. At 120 beats per minute, this works out to be a little over 4 minutes. And then at faster tempos, like 180 beats per minute, it works out to be a little less than 3 minutes. And, you know, I understand that asking you to look at 128 bars of music and then map out individual sections for all 28 of those measures sounds really daunting, but I'm going to show you a process that makes it a lot easier. And it uses the idea of nested forms, where we kind of write like a macro form, and then within that we flesh out a slightly more detailed form and then a slightly more detailed form beyond that. So maybe let's not start with 128 bars right off the bat. Let's start with 32 bars. And it just so happens that 32 bars of music is a really common form in jazz. You can see here in this kind of random tune I picked up out of the real book called My Shining Hour, we have 8 lines of 4 measures each, which works out to be 32 bars. I'm going to try to position this so I can screenshot it later. I won't get copyright striked for that, right? For showing a page of a book. It'll be fine. So let's break this page down into 8-bar sections, which you'll often hear called a phrase. These first 2 lines we'll call the A section. The next 2 lines introduce some new material, so we'll call that the B section. The next 2 lines introduce even more material, so we'll call that section C. And these last 2 bars actually reuse a lot of the material from the A section with a few changes, so we can call that A again, or A prime sometimes is what they call it. So mapping out these 32 bars into 8-bar phrases would look like A, B, C, A. And already you might be noticing how useful this can be because we're not thinking in loops. We're thinking in phrases. We're thinking in these longer stretches of music. So this is a 32 bar form. How do we stretch it out into 128 bars? So for the sake of this, I'm going to call each section of 32 bars one page, which means 4 pages is 128 bars. This is vocabulary I'm just making up. This isn't, music school approved or whatever. So I'm actually going to hop over to text edit to better illustrate some of these points. And here's when we start getting into the nested forms idea. Let's imagine that we're going to map out 4 pages of music, remembering that one page is 32 bars. We're going to call this our macro form. You can think of it kind of like a bird's eye view. We're just getting a very broad sense of what the form is. So this would be our first page of music, 32 bars. This would be a second page of music, completely new material. This would be the same as the first page. Maybe you would develop it a little bit in some way. And then this would be even more new material. If I can put on my electronic music producer hat for a moment, you can kind of think about it like this is your intro / your build. This is your first drop. This is your kind of breakdown into the second build. And then this is the second drop. I should also mention that when I map out these 128 bars, that actually doesn't include the intro and the outro. I kind of consider those just to be little extra bits at the end. The stuff that we're mapping out here is really like the meat of the music, the real substantive material. It also doesn't include things like phrase extensions or what I call hiccup measures, which are sometimes like a measure that's inserted between the, 16-bar build and drop. This form doesn't include that. You can add that later when you get into the nitty-gritty of the arrangement. So now let's nest this form. Let's give our A page a form of, A, A, B, C, maybe? And then our B section could be something like A, B, A. And then our A section repeats, and C can be A, B, A, C, which actually happens to be the same as our macro form, but it doesn't matter. So now if we make sure that we have unique letters for all 3 of these sections, our A section will still be AA, BC. Our B section will actually be D, D, E, D. And then section C will be, what would that be? F, G, F, H. And so now if we map out the whole thing as one long series of phrases, it would look like A, A, B, C, followed by D, D, E, D, and then A, A, B, C again, and then F, G, F, H. So each of these individual letters would represent 8 bars of music. So you could call this something like the phrase form, like a form of phrases. Now, you could stop here. I think this is more than enough to get started. But if you're a psychopath like me, you might want to get even more granular. We can go one layer deeper such that each letter represents 2 measures of music. So the way we would do that is A equals, and then we kind of figure out a form for that. Maybe we can do A, B, B, A, ABBA. And then B could be, A, B, C, B, and C could be A, A, B, A, D could be and I think that's all of them. Yep. So now we flesh all those out into individual letters. That's A, B, B, A still. This would be C, D, E, D, F, F, G, F, D, H, I, I, D, D, J, K, F, D, L, L, M, N, P, O, P, O, Q, H, D, R, S, S, T. So now the whole 128 bar form, such that each letter is 2 bars, would look something like, fast forward. It would look like this. What I like about this, just looking at it, is there's a nice balance of repetition of sections and also repetition of pages, while there's still plenty of variation within each page and within each phrase. So looking at this grid of letters right now, each line would represent a page, 32 bars. Each group of 4 would represent an 8-bar phrase, and each letter would represent a 2-bar phrase that makes up that 8-bar phrase. Each letter, there we go. So what would you actually do with this information, right? Right now it's just a big list of letters. What I would probably recommend right off the bat is writing a rhythm. So you'll notice looking at these letters that the, I guess, highest letter we reach is T, which is the 20th letter in the alphabet. So I'd probably write that down somewhere on this page, like 20 rhythms. Did I spell that right? Yes, I did. So what you could do is just write 20 independent rhythms and then string them together. And also, I want to be clear, when I say rhythms, I don't mean like drum parts or percussion parts. I mean like something you could just clap, a single voice or a single instrument that can act as a focal point for all of the other compositional choices that you make, like your chord progression or your drums or your bass line, etc. Come to think of it, you don't even really need to write them. You could, one moment, you could just take them out of a book like this. If you've ever taken drum lessons, you probably know about this book and you probably hate it. But you could go to, say, for example, one of the kookier pages, page 40. Can I get it in frame? Which is just an endless string of more or less random rhythms that don't subdivide beyond the eighth note. And suddenly you're not looking at a blank page anymore. You're looking at a long series of rhythms that becomes a kind of rhythmic skeleton for your track. It also doesn't have to be rhythms, right? You could use this to write a chord progression or little melodic fragments. And then all of the other normal music writing stuff comes from there. And, you know, I hate to end this video on a note that makes me sound like a music school snob or something like that, but this conversation about breaking out of the loop is not a conversation that classical composers have, or jazz composers have, or film score composers have, because form is one of those essential building blocks of composition that we have to understand on just as deep of a level as we do rhythm or harmony or melody. And, you know, I doubt very highly that people are going to walk away from this video, you know, mapping out 64 two-measure rhythm forms, but I would just broadly encourage people to think more broadly about their form before they start making individual choices within any given section.